I'm Claire Morgan, 31 years old, and standing in the corner of a polished downtown steakhouse, watching the moment I'd dreaded for years unfold. My father had just announced that my brother Andrew would inherit the company I'd worked my whole adult life to strengthen. Then he glanced at me and with a half smile told the room I might be lucky to land a job at a fast food place. If I tried hard enough, the quiet clinking of glasses stopped as Andrew added his own smirk and a line that made a few people chuckle in discomfort. I kept my back straight, my hands steady on the tablecloth, certain that if I moved I might shatter before the night was over. Something entirely unexpected was about to happen. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and tap like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by the very people who should have believed in you most. I grew up in the shadow of Morgan Industries, the company my grandfather built, and my father expanded until its name was known in 3 states. At our dinner table, conversation wasn't about school plays or family vacations. It was about quarterly profits, production targets, and shipping deadlines. My brother Andrew was 5 years older, and from the time he could shake my father's hand, he was the son who would carry on the legacy. I was the child who listened, learned quietly, and brought home straight A's without fanfare. My mother Linda kept her role as peacemaker, smoothing tension before it could ignite, but never challenging the hierarchy my father had set in stone. When I was 12, I spent weeks preparing a presentation on eco-friendly packaging, complete with charts I drew myself and notes on how the shift could save the company money over time. My father skimmed it for less than a minute before handing it back with a dismissive, cute project, Claire turning instead to a half-formed idea Andrew had mentioned offhand. That moment stayed with me, not because it was the first dismissal, but because I realized it wouldn't be the last. Even so, I worked harder honors classes in high school, a business degree, then an MBA from the University of Michigan with top marks. Andrew, meanwhile, partied his way through a degree at a smaller college, joining the company straight into a vice president role. His missteps were written off as learning experiences, while my achievements were filed under team effort, if they were acknowledged at all. I doubled our marketing reach, landed new contracts worth millions, and rebranded our image to draw in younger buyers. Yet the company newsletter credited outside consultants who didn't exist. Whenever I questioned the imbalance, my father's answer was always the same. Andrew made the real decisions, I was just helping. Still, when my father announced his retirement date, I felt a quiet flicker of hope. Maybe the years of results would speak for themselves. Maybe he'd see that leadership could look different from his own. In the weeks before the party, I bought a navy dress I couldn't quite justify, drafted notes for ideas to guide the company forward, and convinced myself that if nothing else, I'd be acknowledged for my work. That night, as I arrived early to help arrange flowers and adjust the place settings, I noticed Maggie, our financial controller of more than 20 years, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She told me the marketing team respected my leadership and that my work mattered, but there was something guarded in her voice. Near the bar, I caught sight of Daniel Pierce, our family lawyer, carrying a thick portfolio and checking his watch. He gave me a brief nod before stepping out to take a call. I didn't know it yet, but by the end of the evening, his presence would change everything. The private dining room filled steadily, the hum of conversations, mingling with the quiet shuffle of servers carrying trays. The scent of seared steaks drifted in from the kitchen, rich and heavy in the warm air. I moved between tables, greeting familiar faces, adjusting a centerpiece here, straightening a place card there, all the while aware of a tightening in my chest. I couldn't shake. Maggie crossed the room to where I stood, her hand resting briefly on my arm. "That color suits you," she said with a small smile, then glanced over my shoulder toward the entrance. Her voice lowered, almost as if speaking to herself. "Everything's in place." Before I could ask what she meant, she stepped away to greet another guest. Across the room, Daniel had returned from his phone call. He lingered near the bar portfolio tucked under his arm, his expression unreadable as he checked his watch again. My Uncle Paul came over, clapping me lightly on the shoulder. Ready for the big night, he asked his cheer, a little forced. I managed a polite answer, though his quick change of subject told me there was more beneath his question. The crowd thickened, and then my father appeared at the door. Robert Morgan carried himself with the same easy authority he always had, shaking hands, exchanging quick remarks, drawing attention without seeming to try. At his side, Andrew moved from group to group, his laughter carrying above the rest. I kept to the edges as the seating was announced. My place card waited at the family table, but set several seats down for my father between my mother and a cousin I hadn't spoken to in months. Andrew, of course, sat directly to Robert's right. As I settled into my seat, I caught a fragment of conversation from two board members passing behind me. "Complete reorganization," one murmured. "She'll be reassigned. Best for all concerned." They fell silent when they realized I could hear them, but the words lodged firmly in my mind. The first courses arrived gleaming on white china. Andrew dominated the conversation, describing grand expansion plans and modernization, though I recognized most of it as little more than flash. My father nodded along, occasionally adding his own thoughts, never looking my way. I listened quietly, answering my cousin's polite small talk, while my mind traced every uneasy detail: Maggie's guarded tone, Daniel's watchful presence, the board member's careless comment. When the main course was cleared and coffee poured, my father rose and stepped to the podium. The room stilled. He began with the company's history, speaking of his own early years at the helm of my grandfather's vision of the long climb to success. He thanked longtime employees by name, weaving in stories that brought nods and quiet laughter. I sat very still, waiting for what I already suspected was coming. Then his tone shifted. "The question of who takes over," he said, "is the most important decision a leader makes." His gaze swept the room. "I have been blessed with a son who understands this company's core, who will carry it forward." He called Andrew to the podium, his voice full of pride. Applause rose around me as my brother joined him, smiling, adjusting his tie. My father's next words came like a cold slap. "As for my daughter Claire, well, the business world isn't for everyone. She might find something else, perhaps, in fast food if she's lucky." A ripple of uneasy laughter broke out, and Andrew leaned into the microphone to add, "She'd mess that up too." For a moment, all I could hear was the thud of my own pulse. My mother's hand gripped mine under the table, but her eyes stayed down. I focused on breathing evenly, keeping my expression neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. Then Daniel stood. The snap of his portfolio closing seemed to cut through the air. "Robert," he said, "there are matters that must be addressed before you continue." My father tried to wave him off, but Daniel stepped to the podium, his voice calm and steady. He spoke of the company's founding of a partner named Edward Chambers, my godfather, and of a clause in the company charter requiring succession to be based on merit, not bloodline. My father's face darkened, but Daniel pressed on. He revealed that he had been documenting both Andrew's and my contributions for years, as Edward had asked before his death. The record showed my contracts landed my rebranding campaigns, the measurable growth in my departments. In contrast, Andrew's tenure had been marked by failed projects, overspending, and most damaging of all, suspicious expense reports. A quiet spread through the room, the weight of the words settling heavily over every table. Daniel turned toward Maggie, who confirmed an independent audit had been conducted in secret. The findings were clear. My departments consistently outperformed targets. Andrews underperformed and overspent. And there was evidence of personal expenses disguised as company business. Gasps and low murmurs filled the air. Andrew's protest rang hollow, his voice tight. The room was no longer looking at him with admiration. Daniel closed by stating that the board must now follow the charter's requirement. All qualified family members must be evaluated on merit, with documented contributions guiding the decision. His final words hung there, shifting the entire mood of the evening. My father gripped the podium silent, while Andrew stared at the floor. Around us, board members exchanged glances. Employees whispered, and I sat very still, absorbing the fact that the narrative of the night had changed. I didn't yet know where it would lead, but the balance in that room had shifted. And for the first time in years, I could feel eyes on me, not with doubt, but with something closer to respect. The dining room had lost its celebratory air, replaced by a low hum of uneasy conversations. I stayed seated, my fingers resting lightly on the tablecloth, trying to take in what had just unfolded. Daniel's words still hung in the air, and the ripple they caused was visible in the way people avoided my father's gaze. Maggie stood near the back, her arms folded, her expression set. Several of the longer-serving employees glanced my way, their faces showing a mix of concern and something else, a quiet approval they didn't dare voice. Andrew broke the stillness first, pushing back from his chair and striding toward me. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to turn heads. "Who have you been talking to?" I rose to meet his stare, keeping my voice even. "I've done my job, Andrew. That's all." He scoffed, leaning in. "This is a setup. You and Pierce cooked this up together. You think your little marketing projects compare to my work." Before I could respond, Susan from accounting stepped closer, her voice steady. "Those projects brought in the Westfield contract last year. Without that, our third quarter would have been a disaster." Andrew turned on her, his tone hard. "Stay out of family business." Richard, one of the board members and my grandfather's old friend, had followed them over. "It's not just family business," he said. "It's company business, and these audit findings will be addressed." My father appeared beside Andrew, his jaw tight. "This situation is being twisted. Daniel has overstepped his role. There will be consequences." I looked directly at him. "What exactly is being twisted, Dad? The numbers my contributions? Or just the fact that Andrew isn't the business leader you've always claimed he is?" The room quieted again, the edges of conversations falling away. "You've always been jealous," he said flatly. "You're using legal tricks to take what you haven't earned." I felt the words more than heard them, but I kept my tone steady. "I've brought in millions in new business. I've modernized our approach and improved results while Andrew was billing vacations to the company. What exactly have I not earned?" Maggie stepped forward, holding her tablet. "Mr. Morgan, the audit shows Pacific Consulting Group billed over $300,000 for services never provided. The funds went to an account Andrew controls." Andrew's face drained of color. "That was market research," he said quickly. Maggie shook her head. "There were no reports, no deliverables, nothing to justify the payments. And there are emails instructing accounting to process them without standard checks." A small cluster of employees had moved closer, their presence forming a quiet ring around us. Michael from operations spoke up, his voice firm. "Claire has been doing the day-to-day work while Andrew takes credit. Everyone knows it. No one says anything because she's your daughter, and that's how it's always been." My father's eyes flashed. "That's insubordination." Daniel's voice came from behind me. "It's not your decision alone anymore, Robert. The charter requires the board to base succession on merit and documented results. Your preference doesn't override that." My father turned on him, his tone cold. "You've been our lawyer for 15 years. Your loyalty should be to me, not to some outdated clause." Daniel didn't waver. "My loyalty is to the company and its governance. Edward Chambers made his wishes clear, and I have an obligation to uphold them." It seemed the entire room had shifted closer, even the waitstaff standing near the door. I took a breath and spoke directly to my father. For 30 years, I've worked for your approval. I've done more than my share, and tonight you stood here and told everyone I was worth nothing. That ends now. He shook his head, starting to say I was too sensitive, but I cut in. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't harmless. You've dismissed me for years, and tonight everyone saw it. The audit is clear, the numbers are clear, I've earned my place here. Andrew stepped forward, his hand tightening into a fist. You ungrateful! He didn't finish. My mother's voice cut through sharper than I'd ever heard it. Enough! She stepped between us, her expression set. I've watched this for years. You've refused to see Claire's strengths because you decided long ago that only a son could lead, and you've ignored Andrew's faults because you saw what you wanted to see. She took my hand, her tone unwavering. Our daughter deserves better, and this company deserves better leadership. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, but edged with something resolute. My father stared at her, his mouth closing without a word. Richard cleared his throat. I think we've heard enough for tonight. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for a board meeting, 9 sharp. Both Andrew and Claire should be prepared, one to present a vision for the company's future and the other to respond to the audit findings. My father opened his mouth, but Richard lifted a hand. Robert, you built something remarkable, but now we have to ensure it's led responsibly. Chairs scraped as people began gathering their coats. A few offered quiet words to me in passing. Others just gave a nod before heading for the door. My father and Andrew left together, their faces set in matching lines of anger. My mother gave my hand a squeeze before following them, her voice low. I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago. I stayed behind as the room emptied, Daniel and Maggie joining me near the corner. You'll need to be ready, Daniel said. The board will expect a clear plan. Maggie gave a small nod. The numbers are on your side, Claire. They always have been. Their presence steadied me. Whatever happened next, the conversation tomorrow would be nothing like the one my father had planned. The next morning, I arrived at Morgan Industries before the sun had cleared the rooftops. The lobby was quiet except for the hum of the security desk. I carried a leather portfolio under my arm, its weight reminding me of everything riding on the hours ahead. The elevator doors opened to the top floor, and the familiar stretch of the boardroom hallway seemed different now, sharper somehow, every detail pulling into focus. Inside, the long mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lights. I chose a seat midway down, neither at the far end where I'd been placed in past meetings, nor at the head where my father had always presided. Daniel came in moments later, giving me a brief nod. The audit summaries are already with the board, he said, placing his folder on the table. The detailed reports will be on hand if anyone asks. Maggie arrived next, carrying a tray of coffee and giving me a quiet, encouraging smile before taking a seat near the end. One by one, the board members filtered in. Richard stopped at my chair, resting a hand on the back for a moment. Your grandfather would be proud, he said simply, before moving on. The rest took their places with a rustle of papers and low greetings. Andrew entered 5 minutes before the meeting, flanked by 2 attorneys I recognized from a prominent downtown firm. He avoided my gaze, his eyes fixed on his seat near the opposite end. My father came in last. His expression set my mother walking beside him with her hands clasped. She caught my eye just long enough to give a small nod. Richard called the meeting to order, noting that with 11 of the 14 members present, a quorum had been reached. Given the unusual circumstances, he began, we'll review the audit findings, then address the succession requirements under the company charter. After that, both Andrew and Claire will present their positions. My father leaned forward. This proceeding is premature and possibly invalid. As CEO and majority shareholder, Daniel interrupted smoothly. Robert, your status as majority shareholder is contingent on following the procedures set forth in the charter. Section 17 states clearly that failure to do so reverts those shares to standard voting status. He passed copies of the clause around the table. Edward Chambers and Harold Morgan put this in place to ensure leadership would always be based on merit. Several members scanned the page, their expressions shifting as they absorbed the language. Richard gave the floor to Maggie. She stood adjusting her glasses and began outlining the audit findings. Charts and figures appeared on the screen, each one reinforcing the same picture, my department's exceeding projections while Andrew's fell short and exceeded budgets. Then came the more serious revelations, personal expenses charged to the company, the shell consulting firm, and altered financial reports. Each point was backed with documents and timestamps. Andrew's attorneys objected at intervals, but Richard kept the meeting on track. When Maggie concluded, Andrew was invited to respond. He leaned back in his chair, his tone measured. These are oversights, not misconduct. Market conditions have been challenging, and some initiatives didn't meet expectations, but that's part of business. My father has always intended for me to lead, and I've prepared for that role my entire life. Richard's voice was steady when he replied, "The legacy includes integrity and performance. The question is whether leadership has been earned." He turned to me. "Claire, your presentation." I stood and handed each member a bound copy of my plan. Over the next 20 minutes, I laid out a strategy built on data modernizing production lines, expanding into eco-friendly packaging restructuring management to reward results over connections. Each proposal tied back to measurable goals and realistic timelines. I spoke of growth that honored the company's history while positioning it for the future. When I finished, a quiet settled over the table. Questions followed, some pointed, some practical, and I answered each with the same steady voice I'd used throughout. Several members who had long deferred to my father now leaned forward, listening intently. The discussion stretched on, circling back to the audit and the charter requirements. Finally, Richard called for a vote on 3 points. The first, that the audit findings were credible and required further investigation. The motion carried 8-3. Andrew's jaw tightened, and his attorneys exchanged low whispers. The second, that the succession process had not met the charter's merit-based requirement, thereby suspending my father's controlling interest. This passed by the same margin. The last vote addressed interim leadership. The decision was to appoint co-leadership. I would oversee operations, marketing, and product development. Andrew would retain his title, but with reduced authority and financial oversight. My father's face was unreadable as the decision was recorded. When the meeting adjourned, he approached me. "You've won this round," he said quietly. "Running this company is harder than you think." I met his gaze without flinching. "I've been doing it for years, Dad. Now I'll get the credit." He didn't answer, turning instead toward my mother, who waited by the door. Andrew left without a word, his attorneys closed behind. Several board members stopped to shake my hand, their congratulations brief but sincere. Richard was the last. "Your grandfather used to say talent sometimes skips a generation," he told me. "Looks like it landed right where it needed to." As the boardroom emptied, I gathered my portfolio, feeling the shift that had taken place. This wasn't the end of the fight, but the ground beneath it had changed. Tomorrow, the work would begin. Taking the elevator down from the boardroom, I could still feel the pulse of adrenaline in my hands. By the time I reached the lobby, the air felt different, lighter, but with a weight of responsibility I hadn't carried before. The moment the doors opened to the main floor, I saw a few employees glance up from their desks, exchanging quiet looks. Word of the meeting was moving fast. The following Monday, I walked into my new office for the first time. It sat just down the hall from my father's, a space I'd passed countless times without ever stepping inside. Sunlight poured in from the large corner windows, falling across a polished desk that still smelled faintly of lemon oil. A single box sat near the wall, holding my things from the marketing floor. Maggie appeared in the doorway carrying a stack of folders. "Your first week is going to be busy," she said with a faint smile, setting them on my desk. We started with the reorganization I had outlined for the board. Department heads rotated through my office, some cautious, others almost relieved. I explained the new reporting system, measurable goals, transparent progress tracking, and recognition based on actual results. Some nodded immediately. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, not yet ready to let go of the old ways. Andrew kept his office but had far less to oversee. The first few days he walked past my door without a glance. I knew he was meeting frequently with his attorneys, but with the investigation underway, most of his authority was already stripped back. Maggie kept me informed of the audit team's progress, and the numbers only reinforced what the board had already seen. Daniel checked in twice that week, reviewing documents that needed my signature and advising on the legal side of the transition. His presence was steady, never overbearing, and I began to appreciate just how much he had done to bring the truth forward. "This isn't about winning against them," he said once, handing me a folder. "It's about running the company well from here on out." By the end of the month, changes were visible. A new product development team was formed, pulling in employees from different departments who'd never worked together before. Meetings became more collaborative, and ideas that would have been dismissed in the past were now being explored. On the production floor, I could sense a shift. People seemed more willing to speak up, to share small improvements that saved time or reduced waste. The eco-friendly packaging initiative moved quickly once we had suppliers lined up. I worked closely with our design team to ensure the new line met both environmental goals and customer expectations. The day we finalized the prototypes, I walked them down to the production floor myself, letting the team see what their input had helped create. Andrew couldn't avoid me entirely. A week into the restructuring, we crossed paths in the hallway outside the conference room. His expression was guarded. "Don't think this means you've won," he said quietly. I met his eyes for a moment. "It's not about winning, Andrew. It's about fixing what was broken." He didn't reply, just pushed open the conference room door and stepped inside. As weeks turned into months, the board received regular updates on progress. Revenue began climbing again, and efficiency reports showed measurable gains. Employee satisfaction surveys came back higher than they'd been in years. Even some of the executives who'd resisted the changes began to acknowledge the results. The investigation into Andrew's expenses concluded with a formal agreement he would repay the misused funds and accept limited responsibilities in client relations, an area where his outgoing personality could still be useful without access to company finances. He signed the documents without comment in a brief meeting with Daniel present. My father came into the office less often now. When he did, he tended to stop by my doorway offering a short remark about a contract or a supplier. It wasn't warmth, but it was a start. One afternoon, he appeared unannounced while I was reviewing quarterly figures. "The Westfield numbers look good," he said, his tone almost neutral. I thanked him, and he lingered for a moment before leaving without another word. 6 months after the board meeting, we closed our most profitable quarter in 5 years. Instead of marking it with a formal dinner, I arranged for a company-wide lunch in the main warehouse, halting production for the afternoon. Tables stretched across the floor, covered in blue and white cloths, with trays of barbecue and fresh salads. I stood on a small platform to thank everyone, making sure to include every department in my remarks. The applause that followed felt different from anything I'd experienced before, genuine, not polite. From the newest hire on the floor to engineers with decades of service, people stopped by to talk, to share ideas, to say they felt hopeful about where we were headed. In that moment, I knew the changes were no longer just plans on paper, they were taking root. By the time the last table was cleared, the noise of the production floor was returning. I walked back to my office, pausing at the window to take in the view of the loading docks below. Trucks were pulling out carrying the work of hundreds of people, work built on a foundation that was finally strong again. And I knew the real test of leadership was just beginning. 3 months into the new structure, the pace of change had steadied into something more manageable. The eco-friendly packaging line was in full production, and early orders had exceeded projections. My days were still long, but the work felt purposeful in a way it hadn't before. Reports crossed my desk, showing measurable gains in efficiency, and for the first time in years, turnover on the production floor had slowed. Andrew had settled into his limited role in client relations. We crossed paths, occasionally exchanging polite but brief words about accounts or schedules. The tension was still there, but the sharp edges had dulled. Maggie kept the finance side steady, ensuring that the new oversight procedures left no gaps. Daniel remained a quiet presence in the background, handling the remaining legal matters from the board's directives. One Thursday morning, I was halfway through reviewing vendor contracts when my assistant buzzed through. "Your father is here," she said. He hadn't scheduled a meeting, but a moment later he stepped into the office. He closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable. "There's something you need to know," he said, taking a seat across from me. "Our supplier in Dayton filed for bankruptcy this morning. They were one of our main sources for the paper stock on the new line." I set my pen down. Losing them could mean production delays, missed deadlines, and potentially losing the new contracts we'd just secured. "Have they stopped shipments already?" I asked. "They have enough to cover this week," he said. After that, nothing. We went over options, sourcing from smaller regional suppliers, shifting production schedules, paying higher rates for expedited shipments. Every choice came with a trade-off, but none would completely close the gap. He listened without interrupting, then leaned back. "Jim Reynolds at North Star still owes me a favor. They could pick up part of the order, but you'd have to work fast." The rest of the day unfolded in a blur of phone calls, negotiation, and quick decisions. We split the work without needing to assign tasks. He called in long-held contacts, and I coordinated with the production and logistics teams to adjust schedules. By early evening, we had secured enough stock from North Star and 2 smaller suppliers to keep production moving with only a minor delay. When the last confirmation email came through, I leaned back in my chair. My father was still sitting across from me, the faintest trace of relief in his eyes. "You handled that well," he said. "Better than I might have." It was the first time I could remember him saying something like that without it being followed by a qualification or a warning. The following week, he began stopping by more often. Sometimes it was to discuss a specific issue, other times just to ask how things were going. It wasn't exactly friendship, but there was a shift, a willingness to share ideas without the undercurrent of dismissal. The board took notice, too. At the next quarterly meeting, Richard commended the handling of the supplier crisis as an example of adaptable leadership. Andrew remained quiet during that discussion, scribbling notes without looking up. By summer, the new packaging line had added 2 more major clients. The cross-department teams were proposing ideas on their own, and I made a point to attend at least one meeting from each group every month. It kept me connected to the day-to-day work and reminded people that their contributions were valued. My father still wasn't one to offer praise freely, but his tone toward me in public settings had changed. At a trade show in Chicago, he introduced me to an industry contact simply as our operations lead without qualifiers or backhanded remarks. It was a small thing, but it landed. Late one evening as I was packing up, Maggie stopped by my office. "You know," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "I think people were ready for this long before it happened. They just needed someone to say it out loud." She didn't wait for an answer, just gave me a small smile and headed down the hall. Her words stayed with me as I locked up for the night. The company was stronger now not because of one decision or one person, but because the culture was finally shifting. And though I knew there were still challenges ahead, the foundation was holding. By early fall, the shifts inside Morgan Industries were visible to anyone who walked through the doors. The breakroom bulletin board, once cluttered with outdated memos, now held project updates and performance charts that employees stopped to read. Department heads sent in progress reports without being chased, and the cross-team meetings were producing ideas that made it into production faster than I'd expected. Andrew kept to his side of the building, his focus narrowed to client meetings and account maintenance. We still exchanged the occasional email about a shared project, but face-to-face conversations were rare. The board's oversight remained in place, and I noticed he had stopped pushing back against Maggie's questions about budgets. One Thursday afternoon, my father appeared in my office doorway. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. He took the chair across from my desk, resting his hands on the armrests. "I've been thinking about the supplier issue we solved earlier this year," he said. "The way you handled production and logistics. It reminded me of how your grandfather approached a problem." I waited, unsure where he was going. He glanced toward the window before continuing. "I was wrong about you, Claire. I thought leadership had to look a certain way, like me, like Andrew. I didn't see what you were already doing." His words were measured, but they landed with the weight of something long overdue. There was no dramatic pause, no change in his expression. Still, it was the first time he had said anything close to acknowledging his mistake. "I appreciate that," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I've always wanted what's best for the company." He gave a short nod, stood, and left without another word. The next day, we sat side by side in a meeting with a potential partner for the eco-friendly line. He let me lead the presentation, only stepping in to add context about the company's history. When the meeting ended, he shook the client's hand and said, "Claire will follow up on the details." It was a small statement, but it told everyone in the room where the authority lay. As weeks passed, I found myself relying more on the leadership team I'd built. Maggie's knowledge of the company's financial structure proved invaluable as we negotiated new supplier contracts. The department leads were quick to identify and correct bottlenecks, and even some of the executives who had been slow to adapt were contributing to discussions. In October, the board reviewed our second consecutive quarter of improved revenue. Richard opened the meeting by congratulating the entire leadership team, noting that the changes had strengthened not only the numbers, but the company's reputation. Andrew sat quietly through most of it, speaking only when asked about client accounts. After the meeting, my mother stopped by my office. She looked around the space, her gaze lingering on the framed photos on the credenza. "Your father won't say it outright, but he's proud of what you've done," she said. "I am too." She hesitated, then added, "I should have spoken up for you sooner." I didn't answer right away, just gestured to the chair across from me. "You did when it mattered," I told her. She smiled faintly, and for the first time in years, our conversation didn't feel like it was avoiding an undercurrent. By the end of the year, the new systems were no longer new. They were simply how the company worked. Performance reviews were based on clear results, and promotions reflected actual contributions. The holiday gathering that December felt different, less formal, more connected. People mingled across departments, sharing updates and ideas without waiting for a scheduled meeting. It was in those small, ordinary moments that I realized the biggest change had taken place. We had shifted from a culture of guarded silences to one where speaking up was expected. And as much as the numbers mattered, it was that shift that would carry us forward. By the time the new year settled in, the tension that had once hung over every meeting was gone. The board no longer felt like a battlefield, and the office halls carried a steadier rhythm. We had grown into the changes, and so had I. Andrew stayed in his client role, and while our conversations were never warm, they were civil. He managed his accounts without incident, and I sensed a quiet acceptance of the limits now in place. My father visited the office less often, but when he did, our exchanges were calm, sometimes even constructive. We would review a contract together or discuss a supplier he knew from years back, and the talk would stay focused on the work. One afternoon in early spring, he stopped by my office unannounced. He didn't sit, just rested a hand on the doorframe. "You've done well," he said simply, then nodded once and walked away. It was not an apology, but it was enough to know we had crossed into new ground. My mother seemed lighter too. Family dinners began again, smaller and quieter than they had been in years. Conversation drifted to normal things, the garden a new recipe she was trying without circling back to the company. She seemed grateful for that. In the months that followed, I put more time into mentoring newer employees. We started a leadership program open to anyone from the factory floor to the administrative offices. Watching people step into responsibilities they never thought they'd have reminded me of how long I'd waited for my own chance. The difference was that now no one had to wait for permission to be seen. The company's growth continued, but the numbers were no longer the only measure of success for me. It was in the way people spoke up in meetings, the way they carried their work with more pride, the way our best ideas came from every corner of the building. Looking back, I can see that the real turning point wasn't the board vote or even the title change. It was the moment I stopped needing someone else to name my worth. Once I let go of that, the work became clearer, the decisions sharper, and the weight of the past a little lighter. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that recognition from others can feel good, but building something you can stand behind and knowing you've done it with integrity will carry you much further. So if you've ever found yourself waiting for someone to see your value, I hope you'll remember this. You don't need their permission to begin. And sometimes when you stop asking for it, that's when they finally notice.